Listen carefully. What I'm about to tell you was never meant for the public record. The courthouse files in Charleston still carry the faded ink, but the story you're about to hear is far older, far darker, and far more dangerous than the neat legal lines on that marriage certificate suggest. Picture a single sheet of parchment, signed twice by the same trembling hand, once as a daughter, once as a wife, the ink blotted by tears we will never see. They filed it away in March of 1855, as if it were just another piece of routine legal business. But behind that signature was a war fought not with soldiers and guns, but with poison, inheritance laws, and the quiet, surgical removal of entire bloodlines. Charleston, in the mid-19th century, wasn't just a city of cobblestones and jasmine. It was a chessboard, and the Beaufort family played for keeps. They did not merely want wealth, they wanted dominion. And to achieve it, they would burn plantations to the ground, erase family names from existence, and use marriage not as a union of love, but as a weapon. Tonight, you and I are going to step into the mansion where it all happened. You will hear the whispers through the locked doors. You will see the shadows cast by the crystal chandeliers as they plot the next accident. And you will understand why Eleanor Ravenel's life and death were never just personal tragedies, but part of a design so precise it borders on the demonic. This is not just a family story. This is a study in power, how it is gained, how it is defended, and how it consumes everyone who touches it. You were not meant to know this. That is why it feels dangerous to even hear me speak. But if you keep listening, if you let me guide you through the dark, I promise you will never look at the American South, or your own family, the same way again. Are you ready to go further? Then take a deep breath, because what comes next will strip away every illusion of safety you have ever had about home, blood, and loyalty. This is where the descent begins. Step into the streets of Charleston, 1847. The air is thick, sweet with jasmine, but underneath it lurks the coppery scent of blood. The carriages of the elite roll past, their wheels splashing through the mud of a city built on rice, cotton, and human bondage. And among these mansions, towering over East Bay Street, stands the Beaufort House. 3 stories of brick and shadow, with a piazza that catches the ocean wind and windows that watch the harbor like sentinels. This house was not merely a home. It was a war room. It was here that Silas Beaufort, the patriarch with ice-blue eyes and a voice that could freeze a man mid-sentence, plotted the family's future. He was no ordinary planter. Silas thought in decades, in bloodlines, in territory maps that stretched from Charleston to Savannah. His empire was built on precision, on the slow erasure of rivals, on legal signatures signed by people who would soon be dead. It was into this house that 10-year-old Eleanor Ravenel was brought after the fire that devoured her parents and their estate. She was small, barefoot, clutching a half-melted doll, her face streaked with ash. Silas received her like a savior, offering shelter, food, education. But make no mistake, this was not charity. This was acquisition. The child was not merely an orphan, she was a key to the last great barrier standing between the Beauforts and total dominion of the Low Country. And from the moment Eleanor crossed that threshold, she was no longer just a girl. She was an asset to be cultivated, controlled, and eventually used. For 8 years she grew under Silas's gaze, educated by the best tutors money could buy, trained to sit straight at supper and hold her tongue at just the right moments. She was beautiful, clever, and, most importantly, obedient. Or so they thought. But inside her, memories were coiled like snakes waiting for warmth. She would lie awake at night staring at the mahogany canopy above her bed, and hear faint echoes from that night. The shouts, the smell of oil, the sound of her mother's voice begging someone to stop. And every time she tried to ask questions, every time she asked about her parents' estate, her past, the fire, she was told the same lie. It was an accident, best to forget. But the past does not stay buried. And in the autumn of 1855, the ground beneath the Beaufort mansion began to shift. The first crack in the Beaufort machine came not with a scream, but with a whisper. One grey October morning, Eleanor discovered a letter that should never have been left behind. It was tucked between the pages of a family Bible in the upstairs study, almost invisible against the yellowed paper. The handwriting was familiar, her mother's, looping and graceful, but the words were jagged with fear. "Silas is coming. He says the deed must be signed tonight. If we do not agree, he swears the house will burn." Eleanor's breath caught as if a hand had closed around her throat. She read it again, and again, until the words blurred. The fire had not been an accident. It had been a message. A warning made good. And the man who had raised her, fed her, educated her, had done it all not from mercy, but from guiltless calculation. For 3 nights, Eleanor barely slept. She moved through the Beaufort mansion like a ghost, memorizing the way the gaslight threw shadows on the stairwell, listening to the muffled conversations from Silas's office. The house that had once felt safe now seemed alive, breathing around her, plotting with every creak of the floorboards. And everywhere she turned, the walls seemed to whisper the same word: revenge. But Eleanor was no ordinary ward. She had been trained by Silas himself. In diplomacy, in patience, in the art of striking at the precise moment when the blow would be most devastating. She began to smile at supper again, to nod politely at Silas's lectures about family honor. She played the role of the dutiful daughter, all the while keeping the letter hidden in her bodice like a talisman. The turning point came during a dinner party in November. The Beauforts had gathered their allies, lawyers, plantation owners, merchants, for a feast meant to seal an important land deal. Eleanor sat at the far end of the table, her eyes lowered, until one of the guests, flushed with wine, made an offhand joke about the Ravenel fire. "A shame, really," he said. "But what could Silas do? Business is business." In that moment, Eleanor knew. The entire table knew. The fire had never been a tragedy to be mourned. It had been a clever move in a game of power. And she, the last Ravenel, was the final piece on the board. That night, after the guests had gone, Eleanor made a decision. She would not merely survive this house, she would turn it inside out. The first move had to be small, invisible, but it had to matter. Eleanor knew that in the Beaufort house, every servant, every ledger, every meal was part of Silas's machinery. To strike too openly was to invite disaster. So she began with the ledgers. Late one night, while the rest of the house slept, she crept into Silas's study. The air smelled of pipe smoke and old leather. The great oak desk was stacked with contracts and maps of the rice plantations, neat as a military campaign. Her heart pounded so loudly she was certain it would wake the entire house. But she forced her hands to stay steady as she turned page after page, searching for the one that mattered. And then she found it. The deed transferring the last of the Ravenel land to the Beaufort family. It was signed, sealed, and dated the night of the fire. A rush of heat went through her, a wave of nausea so strong she had to grip the edge of the desk to keep from collapsing. This was the proof she needed. This was the paper that had cost her parents their lives. She didn't steal it. Not yet. That would be too obvious. Instead, she left it slightly out of place, just enough that Silas would know someone had touched it. She wanted him uneasy. She wanted him to feel, for the first time, that the house was no longer entirely his. The next morning at breakfast, Silas's face was a mask of calm, but his hands betrayed him. They trembled slightly as he buttered his bread. Eleanor watched, silent, serene, sipping her tea. She knew he suspected, and she knew what would come next. The questions, the surveillance, the subtle tightening of control. But she was ready. Every look, every order, every locked door only sharpened her resolve. At night she began meeting secretly with Caleb, the stable boy who had known her parents before the fire. He told her things no one in the house dared to speak aloud. How Silas's men had been seen near the Ravenel property that night, carrying barrels of turpentine. How her father had refused to sell the land until the very last week. Each revelation was another ember in Eleanor's chest, building towards something she could barely contain. She was no longer just surviving, she was planning. And in the Beaufort mansion, A plan was as dangerous as a loaded pistol. By December, the mansion had become a battlefield. Only no one dared call it that. Silas moved like a general under siege, his eyes darting to every corner of the room, every servant who lingered too long near the stairwell. He began locking his study at night, posting 2 housemen near the wine cellar, and keeping the keys to the strong box on a chain around his neck. He said nothing to Eleanor directly, but the message was clear. He knew. Eleanor, for her part, grew bolder. She no longer tiptoed through the house. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had seen behind the curtain. Each day, she practiced her composure, in the gilt mirror at the end of the hall, smoothing her dress, forcing her voice to remain calm, even when Silas's stare tried to pin her to the wall. And then, one rainy evening, the warning came. Caleb, mud-soaked and breathless, appeared at the back door, clutching a torn scrap of paper. It was a notice from the coroner's office, a report of a stable accident that had killed one of the grooms who had been at the Ravenel estate on the night of the fire. His neck had been broken, the report said, from a fall, but Caleb swore the man had been careful, a rider with 20 years' experience. "They're cleaning house," Caleb whispered, eyes wide with fear. "Anyone who knows what happened that night is going to disappear." Eleanor felt the room tilt. The letter hidden in her bodice, the conversations she'd had with Caleb. They were no longer secrets, they were liabilities. And if Silas suspected her of digging too deep, she would be next. That night she lay awake listening to the storm hammer against the windows. Somewhere in the house, a door creaked softly, then shut. She could hear footsteps in the hallway outside her room, slow and deliberate. They paused at her door. For one terrible moment, she thought she heard the click of the latch. Then silence. When dawn came, she rose with a new clarity. There would be no slow, patient revenge. The Beauforts would not stop until every trace of the Ravenels, including her, was gone. If she wanted to live, she had to strike first. And so Eleanor began her real plan, not just to reclaim what was stolen, but to destroy the Beaufort name so completely that it would never again be spoken without fear. The opportunity came sooner than she expected. 2 nights after the storm, Silas left the house for a late meeting with a shipping partner. Eleanor waited until the sound of the carriage wheels faded down East Bay Street before she moved. The study was locked, of course, but Eleanor had been patient these last months. She had studied the key, watched how Silas turned it, counted the seconds it took for the tumblers to fall, and now, with a hairpin and a steady hand, she forced the lock open. Inside, the room smelled of tobacco and damp wool. Gaslight flickered against the shelves of law books and maps, casting monstrous shadows on the wall. Eleanor went straight to the strongbox. She had no illusion that she could break it open, not yet, but she wanted to know what was inside. She pulled open drawers, rifled through papers, scanning for any clue. Then she found it. It was a second deed, not the one she had seen before, but a fresh transfer, one that would grant the Beauforts control over the last Ravenel shipping contract, effectively erasing Eleanor's family name from Charleston commerce. The paper was unsigned, waiting only for Silas's hand. Her pulse hammered in her ears. This was the moment she had been waiting for. If she destroyed this document, the Beaufort expansion would be halted, temporarily. But if she kept it, if she let Silas believe it was safe until the right moment, she could ruin him publicly, strip him of his allies, leave him vulnerable. She folded the paper carefully and hid it beneath her skirts, and then the floor creaked. Eleanor froze. In the doorway stood Mr. Briggs, Silas's steward. A gaunt man with a hawk's face, who had been with the family since before Eleanor was born. His eyes went from the open strongbox to Eleanor's clenched fist. For a moment, neither of them moved. Then Eleanor did something that shocked even herself. She smiled, slowly, calmly, as if nothing were amiss. "I couldn't sleep," she said. "I thought I might fetch a book." Briggs said nothing, but his thin lips curled into something that was not quite a smile. "I will inform Mr. Beaufort," he said softly. From that moment on, Eleanor knew she had crossed the point of no return. The next morning, the house felt different. The servants read in silence, their eyes lowered, as if they sensed a storm gathering. Silas did not speak to Eleanor at breakfast. He did not even look at her. He simply folded his napkin with slow precision, set it beside his plate, and left the room. By noon, the retaliation began. Eleanor's door was removed from its hinges. "For repairs," Briggs said with a polite bow. Her letters were no longer delivered to her room, but held at Silas's desk for his inspection. At dinner that evening, she found her usual place at the far end of the table taken away, replaced with a seat directly beside Silas's chair. He wanted her under his eye, every breath accounted for. That night, Eleanor woke to find her wardrobe ransacked, her drawers overturned, as if someone had searched for the deed she had stolen. The paper was still safe, hidden in a loose floorboard beneath her bed. But for how long? Caleb warned her that men were asking questions in town, looking for anyone connected to the Ravenels. 2 of the old farmhands had already gone missing. "You're not safe here," he urged. "If you stay, they'll put you in the ground like the rest." But Eleanor could not leave. Not yet. If she ran now, she would lose everything. Her family name, her claim to the estate, the chance to destroy Silas where it would hurt him most, in public. And so she stayed, and endured. Each night, Silas began inviting her into the study after supper. The conversations were measured, polite, but laced with barbed undertones. He asked about her studies, her opinions on politics, her thoughts on the future of Charleston society. But Eleanor could see the trap beneath the civility. He was probing, looking for cracks, for any sign that she had betrayed him. One night, as the fire in the study burned low, Silas leaned back in his chair and regarded her with those ice-blue eyes. "You have grown into a remarkable young woman, Eleanor," he said softly. "But remarkable women are often dangerous. Do you think you are dangerous?" Eleanor met his gaze without flinching, "Only to men who deserve it." It was the closest she had ever come to revealing the truth. And for a moment she thought she saw something flicker in Silas's expression. Not anger, not fear. Something colder. Whatever it was, Eleanor understood one thing as she left the study that night. The game had changed. Silas no longer saw her as a child. He saw her as an opponent. Eleanor knew that if she was going to strike, she had to do it where Silas could not simply erase her. In Charleston, power was not just held in ledgers and deeds. It was held in parlors, at dinner tables, in the gossip passed between merchant wives over tea. If she could plant doubt there, Silas would bleed socially before he could bleed financially. The chance arrived at the Beaufort's annual Christmas ball, the grandest event of the season. The mansion was ablaze with candlelight, the piazza draped in holly, the great chandelier glittering like 1,000 captured stars. Charleston's elite crowded the ballroom, planters, merchants, judges, and their perfumed wives. Eleanor descended the staircase like a queen, her white gown gleaming against the dark wood, the hidden deed stitched carefully into the lining of her corset. She smiled, she danced, she charmed. And then she began to speak. At first it was innocent. A casual remark here, a pointed question there. She mentioned her parents' fire, her father's refusal to sell the land, the curious timing of the Beaufort expansion afterward. Her tone was light, conversational, as though she were merely reflecting on the past. But her words were sharp as glass, and she made sure they reached the right ears. By the end of the night, whispers were already circulating. "Did you hear what Miss Ravenel said? Surely she doesn't mean to imply. But isn't it strange?" Silas saw it happening. He stood near the punch bowl, his jaw tight, his hand clenched around his glass ewe, until the knuckles went white. He did not stop her. Not there, not in front of Charleston society. But when the last guest had gone and the house was quiet again, he called her into the study. The air between them crackled. Silas did not raise his voice. He did not strike her. He simply stood behind his desk and said, very softly, "Do not mistake my patience for weakness. If you wish to destroy me, child, you had better not miss." Eleanor said nothing. She only bowed her head politely and left the room. But inside, she was blazing. Silas had just admitted it, not with words, but with his fury. He was guilty, and now all of Charleston would begin to suspect it too. The war was no longer hidden. It had begun. The retaliation was swift. 2 nights after the Christmas ball, Eleanor awoke to the sound of boots in the hallway. Not the soft tread of servants. Heavy, deliberate steps. She rose from bed, heart pounding, and reached for the loose floorboard where the stolen deed was hidden. The board was gone. Before she could react, Briggs appeared in the doorway, a lantern in his hand. "Mr. Beaufort requests your presence," he said. His tone was polite, but his eyes were cold. They brought her to the stables. The night air was damp, heavy with the smell of wet hay and horses. Silas was waiting, his silhouette dark against the lantern light. 2 men stood behind him. Rough-looking dock workers Eleanor had never seen before. "You've been busy, Eleanor," Silas said quietly, as though speaking to a child caught misbehaving, talking out of turn, stirring up things that are better left buried. Eleanor said nothing. Her fingers tightened around the hem of her nightdress. Silas stepped closer, his boots crunching on the straw. "You seem to think you can threaten me with gossip, with whispers. Let me show you what a real threat feels like." He gestured, and one of the men stepped forward, holding something in his hand, a charred piece of wood, the kind used to start fires in the hearth. Silas smiled without warmth. "Do you remember the smell, Eleanor? Do you remember what it sounded like when the beams gave way?" The world seemed to tilt. Eleanor's throat closed, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. "If you want to kill me," she said, her voice steady, "do it here, tonight. But understand this. If I die, every person in Charleston will know why. They already suspect. You can't unring that bell." For a long, terrible moment, no one moved. Then Silas turned away. "Take her back to her room," he said. But Eleanor understood the message. She would not be spared forever. She had been given one last chance to surrender, and she had refused. When dawn came, she sat by the window, staring out at the grey light creeping over the harbour. Her fear had burned away, leaving only resolve. Silas had made a mistake. He had shown her just how far he was willing to go. And now, Eleanor vowed, she would go further. Eleanor's transformation began the very next morning. She no longer moved like a frightened ward. She moved like a woman preparing for war. Her first strike would not be against Silas himself, but against the machine that kept him powerful, his money, his reputation, and his allies. She started with the ledgers. For weeks, she had been memorizing them in secret. Which shipments left the harbour, which merchants were paid, which debts were hidden. She knew which ships were insured, which were not, and which cargo was worth more than its weight in gold. The first target was a rice shipment due to leave Charleston for Savannah. Eleanor slipped into the counting house in town, disguised in a plain cloak, and switched the delivery instructions, sending the shipment to a warehouse owned by one of Silas's competitors. By the time Silas realized what had happened, the rice was gone, sold, counted, and profit pocketed by a rival. Word spread quickly through the merchant circles. The Beaufort name was suddenly associated with carelessness, with weakness. Silas's rivals began to circle like vultures, offering low prices on his goods, questioning his ability to manage his own affairs. But Eleanor wasn't finished. She began writing anonymous letters, to judges, to creditors, to the wives of Silas's allies, hinting at impropriety, suggesting that Silas had taken the Ravenel land under questionable circumstances. The whispers that had begun at the Christmas ball now turned into rumors, and rumors turned into quiet accusations. Silas felt the walls closing in. He prowled the house like a caged tiger, snapping at servants, holding long, angry meetings with Briggs behind closed doors. But every day brought fresh humiliation. A creditor calling in a debt early, a partner withdrawing from a deal, a rival acquiring a piece of land Silas had wanted for years. And through it all, Eleanor smiled. She attended luncheons, appeared at church, walked the streets of Charleston with her head held high. Every move was calculated to show the city that she was no victim. She was a Ravenel, and she was reclaiming her name. But Eleanor knew her attacks could not stay quiet forever. Silas would soon realize exactly who was behind them, and when he did, he would not come with threats or warnings. He would come to kill her. It happened on a moonless night, when the harbor was black and still. Eleanor had just returned from a quiet supper with Caleb, where they'd planned her next strike, a forged letter that would ruin Silas's negotiations with a British investor. She was slipping through the side door of the mansion when she felt it, a hand clamping over her mouth. She fought, twisting, clawing, but another arm pinned her against the wall. Briggs's gaunt face loomed in the dark, his lantern casting long skeletal shadows on the brick. "Not a sound," he hissed. Before she could scream, 2 other men appeared, the same dock workers from the stables. They grabbed her by the arms and dragged her toward the carriage house. Her bare feet scraped against the gravel, her breath coming in short, panicked bursts. Inside the carriage house, Silas was waiting. He stood in the center of the room, his coat off, his sleeves rolled, as though he had been expecting her all night. The firelight from a single lantern flickered across his face, throwing his features into sharp relief. "You've been very busy, Eleanor," he said softly. "Too busy." He stepped closer, until she could smell the tobacco on his breath. "I could end this tonight," he said. "No one would ask questions, no one would dare." Briggs handed him a length of rope. Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. This was no warning. This was an execution. But Silas hesitated. He studied her, his eyes narrowing. And for a moment, Eleanor saw something flicker there. Not mercy, but calculation. "Killing you would be too simple," he said finally, dropping the rope to the floor. "Too quick. No, I think you should stay alive and watch as I tear apart everything you think you've rebuilt. One by one, Eleanor. Every friend, every ally, every scrap of respect your name has clawed back. I will burn it all down again. And this time, I will make sure you are the one blamed for it." He stepped back. "Take her to her room," he ordered, "and nail the door shut." Eleanor was dragged upstairs, her arms aching from the men's grip, her mind reeling. She was still alive, but she understood now that Silas would not stop until she was destroyed. And so, as the hammer struck the nails into the wood of her door, Eleanor made a vow. If Silas Beaufort wanted war, she would give him one. But this time, she would not merely ruin him. She would end him. They had nailed her door shut, but they underestimated her. Eleanor waited until the house was silent, until even the rats in the walls had gone still. Then she worked. The floorboard that hid the stolen deed was Lucino, to pry free, and beneath it she had hidden not only the paper, but a small iron tool Caleb had smuggled to her weeks earlier, a farrier's rasp. For hours she scraped and sawed at the nails, her hands blistering, her breath coming in short, harsh bursts. Each creak of the wood made her freeze, listening for Briggs's footsteps in the hall. By dawn, the final nail gave way. She did not run. She went to the stables. The stable was empty except for Caleb, who had been waiting, his face pale with worry. When he saw her, his relief quickly turned to fear. "They'll kill you if they find you out here," he whispered. "They already tried," Eleanor said. From the wall she took down the lanterns and the canisters of kerosene. Her hands did not shake. "If Silas wants fire," she said, "then we will give him fire." Caleb hesitated. Eleanor. But she was already moving. Together they drenched the supply shed, the one containing feed, tools, and the records of Silas's shipping business, and struck a match. The flames caught fast, roaring to life with a hunger that matched the fury in Eleanor's chest. By the time the house servants woke, the entire shed was an inferno, the night sky glowing orange. Silas came running, shouting orders, dragging men to form a bucket line. But Eleanor stood in the courtyard, her face lit by the blaze, her white nightdress streaked with soot, and she did not look away. When Silas saw her, something passed between them, a moment of terrible recognition. This was no frightened girl standing before him. This was a woman who had declared war. The shed burned to the ground, taking with it months of records and thousands of dollars worth of supplies. Silas's empire would survive the fire, but it would limp, and the entire household knew it had been no accident. Briggs tried to grab her arm, but Silas stopped him with a raised hand. "Let her go," he said, coldly, and Eleanor did go, but not far. She knew she could not run forever. Not yet. Not until she had finished what she started. The first fire had destroyed her family. This fire was only the beginning of hers. The fire had barely cooled before Silas struck back. At first it seemed he had done nothing. No shouting, no punishment, no public outburst. Eleanor almost began to believe he was retreating, licking his wounds. But Silas never struck in anger. His cruelty was careful, deliberate, and precise. 2 days later, Caleb was gone. The servants whispered that he had left town, that Silas had dismissed him without warning. But Eleanor knew better. She searched the stables, the counting house, even the workers' quarters down by the docks. There was no trace of him, no clothes, no letters, no word of farewell. That night, Silas summoned her to the dining room. The table was set with crystal glasses and silver cutlery, as though for a feast. Only one chair had been placed, across from Silas, who sat in his shirt sleeves, sipping wine. "Your friend was quite loyal," he said casually. "He refused to tell me where you've been sneaking off to, so I had to make an example." Eleanor's stomach turned to ice. "Where is he?" Silas's smile did not reach his eyes. "Somewhere no one will ever find him." He poured himself another glass of wine, the sound of the liquid unnervingly calm in the silence. "You see, Eleanor, this is what happens when you burn what is mine. I burn what is yours, piece by piece." She stood frozen, her nails digging into her palms. Silas leaned forward, his voice dropping to a near whisper. "You can still stop this. Surrender the deed. Cease your little campaign. Publicly clear my name at church next Sunday. If you do that, I will let this be the end of it. If you don't—" He let the words trail off, letting the threat hang between them like a noose. Eleanor turned and walked out without speaking. She made it to her room before the tears came. Hot, furious tears that tasted of smoke and salt. Caleb had risked everything for her, and Silas had taken him like a pawn from the board. But instead of breaking her, it hardened her resolve. If Silas wanted to burn everything she loved, then she would leave him with nothing to burn. That night, Eleanor began drafting her most dangerous plan yet, one that would not merely ruin Silas financially, but would expose him before the entire city. If she succeeded, there would be no redemption for him. If she failed, there would be no escape for her. Sunday came, and with it, the perfect stage. Charleston's high society gathered at St. Michael's for morning service, their carriages lined up outside like jeweled beetles glinting in the sun. Inside, the air was heavy with incense, the choir's voices rising like prayer over polished pews. Eleanor sat in the front row, dressed in Ravenel morning black, her veil hiding the cold fire in her eyes. She had spent the entire night preparing, copying the deed, drafting a letter of confession in Silas's own hand, forged with perfect precision. The real deed remained hidden, but the forged papers would be enough to ignite suspicion, enough to make the city doubt him. When the service ended and the congregation began to shuffle out, Eleanor stood. "I have a declaration," she said loudly, her voice ringing off the stone walls. The chatter fell silent. Dozens of faces turned toward her, merchants' wives, magistrates, the pastor himself. And there, near the back, stood Silas Beaufort, his hand resting lightly on the head of his cane. Eleanor stepped into the aisle, holding the letter aloft. "This is a confession," she said, her voice unwavering. "A written admission that the fire which took the Ravenel estate was no accident, that it was set deliberately, and that the man who ordered it was Silas Beaufort." A ripple went through the congregation. Gasps, whispers, a clatter as someone dropped a hymnal. Silas did not move. Eleanor placed the letter on the altar rail, where everyone could see it. "I will deliver this document to the magistrate at noon," she continued, "unless the man responsible steps forward and confesses before this congregation." The church was silent, but for the creak of pews as people craned their necks to look at Silas. He smiled. It was not a pleasant smile. Slowly he removed his gloves and stepped forward, the sound of his boots echoing like a judge's gavel. "What a story," he said softly, his voice carrying. "A shame that this young woman suffers from delusions. Grief can do terrible things to the mind. I suggest we all pray for her soul." He turned, signaling the end of the scene, but the damage was done. The whispers had begun again, and this time they would not stop. As Eleanor left the church, she felt Silas's eyes on her back. She had humiliated him in front of Charleston's most powerful families, and humiliation was something Silas Beaufort never forgave. The city buzzed for days after the scene at St. Michael's. Merchants whispered over ledgers, matrons gossiped over tea, and servants carried the story from house to house like wildfire. Silas tried to keep his composure in public, but behind closed doors, the mask slipped. Briggs reported that he had smashed a crystal decanter against the study wall. He stayed awake long into the night, pacing, muttering under his breath, and writing letters that were burned before morning. Then one evening, Eleanor's door was unlocked. She was ready. She had expected some confrontation, but she had not expected the house to be empty. The lamps were dark, the halls silent. She descended the stairs cautiously, her heart hammering. A faint glow came from the ballroom. Inside, Silas stood alone in the center of the room. The curtains were drawn, and the only light came from the fire roaring in the massive hearth. He was not dressed for company, no coat, no gloves, just his shirt sleeves rolled to the elbows. His cane leaned against the mantel. "Close the door," he said. Eleanor did not move. "Close it," he repeated, softer this time. When she obeyed, he crossed the room, the fire throwing monstrous shadows across his face. "Do you know what you've done?" he asked. His voice was calm, but beneath it there was something feral, barely restrained. "You've made me look weak. In front of them, in front of everyone." He grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "You think you're clever, but you've started something you cannot finish. The city will not protect you, the law will not protect you, and when I am done, no one will even remember your name." He dragged her toward the fire, the heat searing her skin. For a moment, Eleanor truly believed he meant to throw her into it. She struggled, twisting in his grasp, but he was stronger. Then, a crash. The door burst open, and one of the house servants shouted that the dockmaster was at the gate with urgent news. Another shipment had been seized, this time under suspicion of smuggling. Silas's grip loosened. He shoved Eleanor aside, cursing, and stormed out of the room. Eleanor sank to the floor, shaking. She had escaped by pure chance, and she knew next time there might not be an interruption to save her. That night, she stopped thinking about merely exposing Silas. She began thinking about how to kill him. Eleanor did not sleep that night. She sat by her window, watching the lanterns in the harbor sway like restless spirits. Her wrist was bruised from Silas's grip. Her skin still burned from the heat of the fire he dragged her toward. She could no longer deny what she had known all along. As long as Silas Beaufort lived, she would never be safe. This was no longer about reclaiming her name. This was about survival. By dawn she had made her decision. She would kill Silas. Not rashly, not with wild anger, but carefully, with the same cold precision he had used to destroy her family. The plan took shape over the next several days. She learned Silas's habits, when he met with Briggs, when he visited the docks, which nights he drank too much brandy in his study and fell asleep in the chair by the fire. She also began collecting what she needed: a small vial of laudanum, stolen from the house physician's bag, a length of thin rope, coiled and hidden beneath the floorboards, a copy of the key to the wine cellar, smuggled to her by a sympathetic kitchen maid. Each item was a piece of the trap. But Eleanor knew she couldn't do this alone. The thought chilled her, but she reached out to an ally more dangerous than any she had called on before. Jonah Marrow, a former dockhand turned smuggler whose brother had been ruined by one of Silas's fraudulent shipments. They met in secret, down by the harbour, where the fog rolled thick over the water. "You really mean to do it?" Jonah asked, his voice low. "Yes," Eleanor said. "But it must look like an accident. If Silas dies and I am blamed, then everything he said about me will be true." Jonah grinned, a flash of white teeth in the dark. "I know a way," he said. "A ship's mooring can fail very suddenly, especially if someone helps it along. If Silas takes his carriage near the harbour, well, accidents happen." Eleanor felt her heart steady for the first time in weeks. This was no longer about hiding, no longer about running. It was about ending the war. On her terms. And if Silas thought she would break before the end, he was about to learn how wrong he had been. The trap was set in motion on a night when the air felt charged, as though Charleston itself was holding its breath. Eleanor moved with a calm that startled even her. Every step was deliberate, every word measured. At supper, she sat across from Silas, her face serene, as though the last week had never happened. She even poured his wine with her own hand, slipping the laudanum into the glass without the slightest tremor. He drank deeply, neither suspecting. By the time the meal ended, his eyelids had begun to droop, his speech slightly slurred. "Briggs," he said, "the ledgers. Tomorrow." His words trailed off as Eleanor helped him to his feet, her arm steady beneath his. Instead of leading him to his study, she steered him toward the carriage waiting outside. "The harbour air will clear your head," she said softly. Silas barely protested. He allowed himself to be settled into the carriage, Briggs at the reins, Eleanor seated across from him. They rode in silence through the sleeping streets, the clatter of hooves echoing like a heartbeat against the cobblestones. Down by the harbour, Jonah and his men waited in the fog. They had weakened the moorings of one of the heavy loading cranes, leaving it poised like a guillotine over the pier. All that remained was for Silas's carriage to stop at the right place, at the right moment. Eleanor's pulse thundered as they approached the pier. "Stop here," she told Briggs. As the carriage rolled to a halt, Jonah gave the signal, a single whistle, sharp and quick. One of his men yanked the final pin loose. There was a groan of metal, a scream of rope, and then the massive crane arm swung downward. Briggs shouted and leapt clear. The horses reared. The carriage tipped violently as the beam struck the edge of the pier, splintering wood and sending sparks into the night. Silas woke with a roar, shoving the door open and stumbling out into the chaos. For a moment, Eleanor thought it was over, that the falling timber would crush him. But Silas moved fast, faster than she thought possible, rolling out of the way as the beam slammed into the ground inches from where he had been. When he rose, his eyes were blazing, and they were fixed on Eleanor. "Clever," he said, his voice low, dangerous. "Very clever." The harbour fell silent except for the creak of the crane and the panic, the snort of the horses. Eleanor's plan had failed, and now there would be no more pretenses, no more veils of civility. Silas knew she wanted him dead, and now he would return the favour. The harbour never slept, but that night it held its breath. Silas took a single step toward Eleanor, and she bolted. Her shoes slipped on the wet planks as she sprinted down the pier, the night air ripping at her hair. Behind her came the pounding of boots, Briggs and the dockhands, Silas shouting orders like a general on a battlefield. "Find her!" Eleanor darted between stacks of crates, weaving through the narrow alleys of the dockyard. The fog wrapped around her like a shroud, making every shadow a threat. Somewhere behind her, a lantern was dropped, shattering, fire spilling briefly across the wet wood before fizzling out. She could hear Silas's voice, calm now, deadly calm. "Run, Eleanor. Run as far as you can. It will make catching you sweeter." She ducked into a storage shed, her breath ragged, and pressed herself against the wall. Outside, the footsteps slowed. Briggs's voice drifted through the fog. "She's close." The door creaked open. Eleanor grabbed the first thing she could find, a rusted marlinspike, and swung. The iron point connected with Briggs's arm, and he howled in pain. She shoved past him, bursting back into the night. This time she did not head for the mansion. She knew Silas would expect that. Instead, she ran deeper into the city, into the maze of streets and alleyways where the watchmen rarely patrolled. By the time she reached the old market square, her lungs were burning, but she dared not stop. Behind her, Silas's cane struck the stones in an even rhythm, steady as a clock. He was no longer running. He was stalking her, letting her tire herself out. Eleanor darted into a tavern back door, startling the barkeep. "Hide me," she gasped, but the man only shook his head and pointed toward the front, where more of Silas's men were spilling into the street. There was no help here, no safe place left in Charleston. "Au boisson." He stumbled back outside and climbed the narrow stairs to the rooftop. From there, the city spread out before her, the harbor burning with lanterns behind her, the church spires cutting black shapes against the moonless sky. She realized with a sick twist of dread that this was what Silas wanted. He was not just hunting her. He was driving her, cornering her, shaping the endgame until there would be nowhere left to run. And when that moment came, only one of them would walk away. By dawn, Eleanor knew the running had to end. Her body ached from the night's chase, her palms were blistered from climbing the rooftops, and her gown was torn to shreds. But her mind was sharper than ever. Silas had forced her into a corner, but in a cornered animal lies the most dangerous kind of fight. She made her way to the outskirts of the city, where the ruins of her family's burned estate still stood like blackened teeth against the horizon. The locals avoided the place, whispering that it was cursed. To Eleanor, it felt like coming home. If Silas wanted a reckoning, this would be the place. She spent the next 2 days turning the ruins into a trap. The charred beams and fallen masonry became weapons, the collapsed cellar a perfect pitfall. She rigged tripwires from old rope, scattered broken glass where a man might stumble, and dragged a fallen door across the ground to hide the entrance to the old well. When the preparations were done, she left a single clue, a blood-stained scrap of her dress, nailed to the gate of Silas's counting house. It was an invitation. That night, the moon rose full and silver over the ruins. Eleanor waited in the shadows, the marlinspike still gripped in her hand, her heartbeat calm. She did not wait long. The sound of hoofbeats came first, then the crunch of boots on gravel. Silas arrived with Briggs limping behind him, his arm still bound from where she had struck him. They carried lanterns, their glow casting monstrous shapes across the broken walls. "Eleanor," Silas called, his voice mocking, "this is where you choose to die. How poetic." But Eleanor did not answer. She watched, silent, as they moved deeper into the ruins, exactly where she wanted them. The first tripwire snapped, and a beam crashed down behind them, blocking the way out. Silas spun, eyes narrowing, and for the first time Eleanor saw it. Not anger, not even hatred. Recognition. He understood now that he was not hunting her anymore. She was hunting him. "Very clever," he murmured, almost to himself. Then louder, "So this is how it ends?" "Yes," Eleanor said, stepping into the moonlight. Her voice was calm, her trap was set. And this night, one way or another, the fire that had started years ago would finally burn itself out. The air between them was electric, charged like the moment before a storm breaks. Silas's hand went to the pistol at his hip. Eleanor lunged before he could draw, swinging the marlinspike. The iron struck his forearm, and the pistol clattered to the ground. Briggs moved to grab her, but she kicked him hard in the knee, sending him crashing into the rubble with a cry of pain. The ruins came alive with violence. Silas charged, catching Eleanor by the wrist and slamming her against a scorched wall. The breath left her lungs in a rush. "You should have stayed quiet," he growled. "You could have lived." But Eleanor's other hand found a shard of glass from the ground. She slashed it across his shoulder, breaking free. They circled each other now, breathless, the firelight from the lanterns throwing wild shadows on the blackened stone. This was no longer society's game, no longer about deeds and ledgers and polite threats. This was survival, raw, brutal, and final. Silas came at her again, faster than she expected, but she had spent days planning this ground. She darted backward over the collapsed cellar, her foot just barely avoiding the spot she had left as a false step. Silas followed, and the rotten wood gave way beneath him. He dropped with a roar, crashing into the cellar below. Eleanor was on him before he could recover, wrenching the marlinspike from the ground and holding it high. Silas looked up at her, his face bloodied, his expression almost amused. "Do it," he said, his voice low. "Prove you're just like me." Eleanor's hands shook. The fire from the lantern seemed to roar louder, like the night her family died. For a heartbeat she saw her father's face, her mother's scream, the house collapsing, and then she drove the marlinspike down. Silas gasped once, then went still. The only sound was Eleanor's ragged breathing and the crackle of the fire. Briggs had dragged himself to the edge of the cellar. His face was pale, his eyes wide. "You've killed him," he whispered. Eleanor climbed out slowly, her hands covered in blood, her body shaking with exhaustion. And something else. Relief. For the first time since the fire, she was free. But freedom came with a cost. Briggs fled into the night, and she knew he would tell the city what had happened. Charleston would wake to a new story at dawn, and Eleanor would have to decide whether to run or to face what she had done. The night seemed to hold its breath after Silas's last gasp. Eleanor stood at the edge of the ruined cellar, staring down at the stillness below. The lantern flames flickered and hissed, casting jagged shadows across Silas's body. Somewhere in the distance, a dog barked, and then the world was quiet again. She wanted to collapse, to weep, to scream, but there was no time. Briggs was gone. By dawn, he would have told half the city what had happened, though whether he would call it murder or justice, Eleanor could not say. Perhaps it didn't matter. She moved quickly, gathering what she could. She wiped her fingerprints from the pistol, left it near Silas's body, and scattered the forged deed pages across the ruins like ashes. Let them find it all. Let them read the story for themselves. When she stepped out, through the charred gate, the first light of morning was spilling across the horizon, painting the sky in streaks of crimson. It looked like fire. Eleanor could run. She could disappear down the coastal road, vanish into the back country, find passage on a ship to New Orleans or even England. She could leave Charleston, leave everything behind. But as she stood there, she felt something shift inside her. All her life, Silas had dictated her choices, her home, her name, her very survival. Killing him had not just ended his reign over her life. It had burned away the last illusion that she was powerless. She would not run. When the sun finally rose, Eleanor was still standing in the road. When the first riders came, neighbors, magistrates, curious townsfolk drawn by the smoke, they found her waiting. She did not hide what she had done. "I killed him," she said simply. "Silas Beaufort burned my family alive. Tonight I returned the fire." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Some crossed themselves, others nodded, grim and silent. By noon, the story had already spread across Charleston. Some called it murder, some called it justice, but everyone called it brave. And when Eleanor walked back through the city streets that evening, head unbowed, no one dared stop her. For the first time since the fire, she was not just a survivor, she was a Ravenel again. Charleston woke to scandal. By mid-morning, the magistrate had sent men to the Ravenel ruins. They found Silas Beaufort's body still in the cellar, the marlin spike protruding from his chest like a grim flag planted in victory. The scene was too dramatic to be called anything but deliberate. Whispers spread faster than the morning tide. "Did you hear? Eleanor Ravenel killed him with her own hands. They say she lured him to the estate like a hunter sets a trap. Perhaps she was mad, or perhaps she was right." By the time Eleanor was summoned to stand before the magistrate, the entire city seemed to have chosen sides. Half of Charleston came to the courthouse. Merchants, housewives, servants, even rival planters who had secretly hated Silas for years. The gallery buzzed like a swarm of hornets as Eleanor stepped inside, dressed in simple black and wearing no veil. She did not deny what she had done. "He murdered my family," she said clearly, her voice steady. "And when the law would not punish him, I did." The room fell silent. The magistrate's face was grave. "Do you understand the weight of your confession? The penalty for murder is death," Eleanor finished. "Yes, but Charleston already sentenced my family to death when they allowed Silas to walk free. I am only collecting a debt." A murmur rippled through the crowd. The magistrate hesitated. Briggs was called as a witness, his arm still bound. His testimony was quiet, measured, and to everyone's surprise, he did not condemn Eleanor. "She gave him a chance to stop," he said. "He would not. Perhaps the fire was always meant to end this way." By the end of the day, the magistrate delivered his judgment. Eleanor would not hang. The killing was ruled an act of personal vengeance, unlawful, but not without provocation. She would pay a heavy fine, forfeit a portion of her inheritance, and remain under watch for a year. The verdict divided the city. Some said she had escaped justice. Others called her the bravest woman in Charleston. The gossip only made her name grow louder, until she was no longer just Eleanor Ravenel, but a symbol, a warning, and a legend. That night, Eleanor stood on the balcony of the mansion Silas once owned, staring out at the harbor. The city was still whispering about her, but she no longer feared its whispers. For the first time, they were speaking on her terms. In the weeks that followed, Charleston could not stop speaking her name. Every parlor, every dockside tavern, every marketplace hummed with the tale of Eleanor Ravenel, the woman who had turned her family's tragedy into vengeance, who had slain Silas Beaufort in the very ashes of the house he burned. Some called her dangerous, others called her necessary. And soon, Eleanor realized that fear and respect often walked hand in hand. Merchants who once refused to deal with her now offered her better terms, desperate to be seen as on the right side of history. Families who had once turned their backs began sending formal invitations, thinly veiled apologies wrapped in embossed envelopes. Even the city council seemed to step more carefully, aware that one misstep could earn them her public condemnation, or worse, her quiet attention. But Eleanor did not seek revenge any longer. She used her newfound power differently. She began investing in the dockside workers, who had once whispered rumors about her family, giving them fairer wages and safer conditions. She reopened trade routes Silas had monopolized and cut predatory taxes on the smaller plantations. Slowly, Charleston began to shift. Not because its men wanted justice, but because they feared the kind of justice Eleanor represented. At night, Eleanor walked the burned ruins one last time. The weeds had begun to grow through the scorched beams, claiming the land back from its ghosts. She no longer felt the fire's heat when she stood there. What had once been her prison had become her altar. People began leaving tokens at the site. Scraps of ribbon, coins, little carved figures, as if paying homage to the spirit of vengeance that lived there. Some swore they had seen Eleanor's silhouette at the gates in the moonlight, a spectre watching over the place. And in the minds of many, she stopped being merely a woman. She became a story. Parents told their children about her when they spoke of courage. Servants told her story in the kitchens when they spoke of justice. Men whispered her name in dark corners when they spoke of fear. Eleanor had set out to destroy one man. Instead, she had remade an entire city. And though she never said it aloud, she understood something with cold, perfect clarity. Legends burn longer than fire. Power came with silence. When the crowd stopped whispering, when the petitions were signed, when the merchants bent their knees and the council voted her way, Eleanor found herself alone in the mansion Silas once ruled. The rooms were too large, too quiet, echoing with 1,000 memories that refused to die. At night, she still woke to the sound of fire. Sometimes she dreamed of the cellar, of Silas staring up at her, daring her to strike. Sometimes she dreamed of her mother's scream, the taste of smoke in her throat, the way the world had burned around her and left her standing. Justice had been done, but justice had not made her whole. One evening she stood before the mirror in her dressing room, the last lantern flickering low. She studied her reflection, the sharpness of her cheekbones, the smudge of soot that seemed forever in her eyes, the faint scar on her wrist from where Silas had once gripped her. "Who are you now?" she whispered. The city saw her as a symbol, a force of reckoning. But inside, she still felt hollow, as though she had poured too much of herself into the fire and left nothing but ashes behind. The few who visited her found her changed. She spoke less, smiled rarely, and when she did laugh, there was an edge to it that unsettled even her allies. The workers she had helped still greeted her warmly on the streets, but she no longer lingered to chat. It was as if Eleanor had given them all her strength, and kept nothing for herself. One night she returned to the ruins again. She stood where the cellar had been, the moon silvering the weeds. She imagined Silas's voice behind her, mocking her as he always had. But this time she did not flinch. She knelt and pressed her palm into the earth, the way she had when she was a child, searching for something to hold on to. The soil was cool. For the first time, Eleanor did not think of fire. Instead, she thought of roots. Perhaps her family's legacy had not been meant to burn away, but to grow back, stronger, from the ashes. When she stood again, there was a strange calm in her chest. For the first time, she wondered if vengeance had only been the beginning, and if she might yet find a way to live. The first step toward rebuilding was small. Eleanor hired masons to clear the last of the charred beams from the Ravenel estate. She did not instruct them to rebuild the mansion, not yet, but to lay a foundation, something solid and unshakable. It must last, she told them, even if the house above it falls again. Word spread quickly. Some called it defiance, others redemption. Neighbors began stopping by the site, leaving tools, bricks and timber. Quiet offerings of solidarity. Eleanor had not asked for their help, but they came anyway. It startled her how much that meant. For years she had been at war with Charleston, with Silas, with fate itself. Now, for the first time, she felt the city slowly turning toward her, as if it too wanted something more than blood. And then came Samuel. He was a shipwright from the harbor, broad-shouldered, with hands scarred from years of shaping wood. He had been one of the first to take Eleanor's improved wages, and now he came to offer her something else. A new gate for the estate, carved by his own hand. "You should have a way to welcome people back," he said, placing the gate against the fence line. Eleanor almost told him to leave. She almost reminded him that she was not here to welcome anyone, that this place was a tomb. But when she saw the carving, a raven in flight, wings stretched wide, she felt something shift inside her. It was not a symbol of mourning, it was a symbol of becoming. In the weeks that follow, Samuel returned again and again, helping the masons when their work slowed, bringing her small parcels of food when she forgot to eat. He never asked about Silas, never flinched at the stories whispered about her. And Eleanor, though wary, found herself listening when he spoke, not just to his words, but to the quiet steadiness in them. One evening, as the sun set gold over the half-cleared ruins, Samuel stood beside her and said, "When this is done, Will you build something new? Eleanor looked at the ground, at the place where her family had once stood, at the place where Silas had fallen. Yes, she said at last. Something new. And for the first time in years, the word did not feel like a threat. It felt like hope. The day the first stone was laid, the entire city seemed to hold its breath. Eleanor stood at the edge of the cleared foundation, dressed not in black, but in a simple white gown. A quiet declaration that this was not a funeral, but a beginning. The masons waited. The workers gathered in a respectful semicircle, and even the magistrate came to watch. Eleanor knelt, her hand brushing the smooth, pale block of granite that would mark the corner of the new house. She felt its weight, its permanence, and for a moment she imagined her parents standing behind her, watching. This ground has known fire, she said aloud, but today it will know something stronger. She pressed her palm to the stone, and the masons set it into place. A cheer rose from the workers, not wild, not celebratory, but full of something steadier, pride. When the others drifted away, Eleanor remained. Samuel lingered at her side, his hands in his pockets, watching the sunlight catch the stone. "It suits you," he said. Eleanor glanced at him. "You think a house suits me?" "No," he said softly. "A beginning does." For weeks, Samuel had been at her side, never demanding more than she could give. But tonight, with the foundation finally set, Eleanor felt the question she had been holding rise like a tide inside her. "Samuel," she said, her voice quiet, "why do you keep coming back?" He smiled, slow and a little sad. "Because you remind me what it means to fight for something worth building." Eleanor's heart twisted. She had been forged by fire, sharpened by vengeance. She was not sure she knew how to be anything else. But as she looked at Samuel, standing there among the stones of her family's past, she realized she did not have to choose between what she had been and what she could become. She could be both. "I can't promise you peace," she said at last. "I can't promise I'll ever stop being the woman who burned a man's name out of this city." Samuel's gaze was steady. "Then don't promise me peace. Promise me truth." Eleanor took a long breath, then she nodded, and for the first time since the fire, she let someone stand beside her, not as a witness to her vengeance, but as a partner to her future. It took nearly 2 years to finish. When the last scaffolding came down, the new Ravenel house stood gleaming in the afternoon light. Not a copy of the old mansion, but something entirely its own. It was simpler, stronger, built of pale stone that would not burn easily, its windows wide to let the sea air in. Charleston came to see it, not just neighbors and merchants, but strangers from the far edges of the state. They came to look at the woman who had turned tragedy into justice, the house that had risen from fire, and the story that had grown larger than any single person. Eleanor greeted them all. She no longer hid her scars or her sharpness. She walked the halls with her head high, her presence as commanding as the house itself. Some said she frightened them. Others said she inspired them. Either way, no one doubted that the Ravenel name had returned to power. Inside, Eleanor's life was quieter. She filled the rooms with books instead of portraits, music instead of politics. The estate became a place where dock workers and planters alike gathered to speak of reform, where voices once silenced found a way to be heard. It became more than a house. It became a refuge. And through it all, Samuel remained. He did not try to tame her or soften her edges. Instead, he helped her turn the estate into something that could outlive them both. Together, they oversaw the planting of orchards where the ruins had been, the creation of a school on the edge of the property, and the rebuilding of the workers' cottages that had been neglected for years. At night, when the sea wind rattled the shutters, Eleanor sometimes still woke to dreams of fire. But now, when she stepped to the window, she saw the orchard swaying in the moonlight, green and alive. And she smiled. Years passed. Eleanor's hair silvered, her steps slowed, But her gaze never lost its sharpness. The people still whispered her name, though now it was with reverence rather than fear. When she died, they buried her beneath the great oak that had survived both the first fire and the second. The stone over her grave read simply, Eleanor Ravenel. She burned and she built. And for generations afterward, the children of Charleston would point to the house on the hill and say that it had been raised by the woman who turned fire into stone, and vengeance into something greater. The house is still there. I grew up hearing the story of Eleanor Ravenel, the girl who survived the fire, the woman who brought a city to its knees, the legend who built a house so strong that it has stood for 100 years without falling. My grandmother used to take me by the orchard at dusk and point to the carved gate, still bearing the raven in flight. She chose that, she'd whisper, as if Eleanor might be listening from the branches overhead. Not a phoenix, not an angel, a raven, a creature that carries the dead secrets and still keeps flying. Charleston has changed since her time, but her story hasn't faded. They teach it in the schools now, not as a cautionary tale, but as a testament to what one person can do when the world tries to break them. Some say she was a hero, some say she was a murderer, but everyone agrees she was unstoppable. On quiet nights when the wind rushes through the trees, the old women still say they can see her walking the orchard paths, her white gown trailing like mist, her head held high. They say she guards the house still, and sometimes when I walk there alone, I swear I feel her near. Not angry, not sorrowful, but watchful, as if making sure the ground she bled for stays true. I think that's the real legacy she left us. Not just the house, not just the orchard, but the knowledge that even when the world burns you down, you can rise from the ashes, not as who you were, but as who you choose to be. And when I leave the estate, I always stop at her grave, under the great oak. The stone is simple, just as she wanted. I press my fingers to the words carved there, and whisper the same thing every time. Thank you. Because without Eleanor Ravenel, Charleston might have been just another city that let its fire go out, but because of her, and the legend she became, it still burns. Years turned into decades. The Ravenel house weathered storms, floods, even a war that briefly turned Charleston into a battlefield. But it never burned again. Travelers came from distant cities just to see it. Painters sketched its pale walls and its orchard bathed in moonlight. Writers compared it to a fortress, a cathedral, a shrine, and always they spoke of Eleanor. By then, the details of her story had grown larger than life. Some claimed she had struck Silas Beaufort with a single blow, killing him instantly. Others swore she had stood over him and recited her family's names before driving the marlinspike home. A few whispered that she had made a pact with the fire itself, that the flames that once destroyed her house had chosen her as their keeper, granting her a destiny too fierce for mortal judgment. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was what she had become, a symbol of defiance, a reminder that the powerful could fall and that even in the ashes there could be rebirth. Generations of Ravenels carried that fire forward. Her school became one of Charleston's most respected institutions. Her estate became a gathering place not for elites, but for thinkers, reformers, poets, and dreamers. And every year, on the anniversary of the fire, they lit lanterns along the orchard paths, filling the night with 1,000 small flames. No one called it a vigil. They called it the Night of Becoming, a night to honor not only Eleanor, but the part of themselves that refused to bow to the darkness. Children grew up knowing her story by heart. Lovers walked beneath the oak that shaded her grave and promised each other courage. Old men, broken by loss, came to sit by her stone as if seeking permission to start again. And the city itself changed. Charleston was no longer just a place of polite facades and silent injustices. It became a place where people remembered that one woman's refusal to be erased had forced an entire community to confront its own reflection. If you stand on the porch of the Ravenel house on a summer night, when the wind is still, you can almost hear it. The faint sound of a woman's footsteps, pacing the halls, keeping watch. And if you listen closely, you might hear her whisper too, "Do not let the fire die." And somehow, you know you won't. The camera drifts back, rising over the Ravenel estate. The house glows faintly in the moonlight, its windows catching the starlight like watchful eyes. Beyond it, the orchard stretches dark and still, each tree a monument to what was lost and what was reclaimed. A single lantern flickers by the gate, the raven carved into the wood, seeming almost alive as the shadows dance across it. And then you hear it, faint, almost too quiet to notice. The sound of footsteps on the gravel path. Slow, deliberate. A woman's silhouette crosses the orchard, her white gown trailing like mist, her head bowed just slightly as if in thought. She stops beneath the oak where the grave lies, rests her hand on the stone, and turns her face toward the house. For a moment, you think she sees you. And then the lantern's flame flares bright, impossibly bright, until the screen is filled with gold light. When the light fades, the orchard is empty. But the gate stands open, swinging gently in the night wind. And somewhere, just beyond hearing, a woman's voice whispers, "The fire never dies." The screen cuts to black. 50 years after Eleanor's death, the Ravenel estate had become a place of pilgrimage, not just for Charlestonians, but for anyone who had ever lost something and needed to believe they could rise again. Travelers from across the country came to walk the orchard, to touch the stone walls, to leave flowers at the oak where Eleanor lay. And her story kept changing, as all great legends do. In New Orleans, they told it as a tale of a ghostly widow who burned her husband and cursed a city. In Savannah, she became a freedom fighter, a woman who struck down tyranny with her bare hands. In the northern states, she was cited in speeches about justice, a symbol of what it meant to refuse silence. But in Charleston, she was still something more intimate. Parents took their children to the orchard and told them that the trees only grew because of Eleanor's courage. Teachers reminded their students that the house was not just a monument to tragedy, but to choice, that even when the law fails, a single person can decide to become justice. And every year on the anniversary of the fire, the night of becoming grew. Lanterns no longer lined just the orchard path, they spread into the streets, hundreds of small flames flickering against the dark. People told Eleanor's story aloud, adding their own words, their own interpretations, until it felt less like history and more like a ritual. Sometimes the skeptics mocked it. She was no saint, they would say. She was a murderer who got away with it. But even they lit lanterns, because deep down they understood that the story was no longer about Eleanor alone. It was about everyone who had ever been broken and still stood up again. And on certain nights, when the moon was high and the wind was still, visitors swore they could see her watching from the balcony, her silver hair shining, her hand resting on the railing as if she were counting the lights one by one. And those who saw her never left, afraid. They left, changed. It was a stormy afternoon when the discovery was made. The Ravenel house had been undergoing preservation work, the kind of careful restoration that required peeling back wallpaper and prying open floorboards. And behind one such board, wedged deep into the wall, they found a small iron box. Inside were letters, dozens of them, their edges browned with age, their ink faded but still legible. Each was addressed simply, "To whoever comes after." They were not confessions. They were not apologies. They were revelations. In one, Eleanor wrote of the night she killed Silas Beaufort. "I did not feel hatred," she wrote. "I did not even feel anger. I felt something far more dangerous. Clarity. For the first time since the fire, I could see the shape of my life, and I stepped into it willingly." Another letter was softer, written to the children who had never lived to grow up. "I plant this orchard for you," she wrote. "Every tree is a promise, that the world you should have known will live, if not for you, then through me." And perhaps most haunting was the final letter, written in a hand that trembled with age. "If you have found these words," it said, "then you too are standing where I once stood between despair and defiance. Choose defiance, even if it burns you, especially if it burns you. The fire is not punishment, it is transformation. When the Bourne letters were published, Charleston changed again. People read them aloud during the night of becoming, weeping openly beneath the lanterns. Some said they felt Eleanor standing beside them as they read. Others claimed to hear her voice whispering the words in their ears, and suddenly Eleanor Ravenel was no longer just a ghost story or a cautionary tale. She was a guide, a teacher, a presence. The orchard became more than a memorial. It became a place of initiation. Visitors didn't just come to see it, they came to leave a piece of themselves behind, to bury their old lives in its soil and start again. And every new beginning felt like it belonged to her. The camera opens on the present day. A young woman stands at the gates of the Ravenel estate, her phone in one hand, her other hand resting on the weathered wood. She's not a local. You can tell from her clothes, her accent, the hesitation in her step. She's here because of the letters, because she too has lost something. Inside the orchard, the lanterns are already lit for the night of becoming, hundreds of them, flickering in the dusk. Families walk the paths in silence, strangers nod to each other like pilgrims. The young woman kneels beneath the oak where Eleanor lies, holding a scrap of paper. Her hands shake as she writes, "I don't know if anyone will ever read this, but I came here because I needed to remember who I am. Tonight, I choose not to disappear." She folds the paper, presses it into the soil, and stands. As she turns back toward the house, a warm wind moves through the orchard. The lantern flames flare bright, all at once, as if answering her, and for the briefest moment, she sees her. Eleanor Ravenel, standing on the porch, watching. Her hair silver in the lantern light, her face calm, almost proud. The vision lasts only a heartbeat before the night swallows it. But the young woman smiles through all her tears. When she leaves the estate, she is not the same person who arrived. She walks faster. Her shoulders are straight. Her phone is still in her hand, but now she raises it, not to escape the moment, but to capture it. And as she walks through the gate, the camera pans back, showing the orchard glowing like a field of stars, the house watching over it all. Eleanor's voice, faint, ageless, whispers one last time, "Carry it forward." The screen fades to black, and somewhere, far beyond the walls of Charleston, another lantern is lit. Because the fire never dies,